Just letting everyone into our event today. Thank you so much for your patience. And there it goes. Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining our live virtual event tonight with Professor Margret Grebowicz and Mark Yakich. I'm your host, Jessica, here at the Country Bookshelf on the ancestral unceded land of the Apsalaki Crow, Salish Kootenai, Cheyenne, Shoshone Bannock, and Acadian people. We encourage those of you joining us from outside Bozeman and Montana to learn about the stories of the land you reside on and its peoples. We are very excited tonight to be exploring the philosophy and ethics of modern mountaineering and what all of that means with mountains and desire tonight. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on all the happenings at Country Bookshelf, and of course, future events. You can follow us on Eventbrite as well. We do have more wonderful nature, environment, ethic writing coming up. Next Wednesday at 6 p.m. we'll continue this exploration with Dr. Catherine Raven and her book Fox and I. So do check us out on Eventbrite to see what that's about. Before we get to our speakers this evening, I want to point out a couple of things about our digital space here. I'm going to be dropping a link into the chat momentarily for those of you that may not have purchased your copy of Mountains in Desire with your registration, but it will be a link to do so because hopefully we will get you all fired up to dive in as we go through the evening. This evening is also being recorded, so if you have to leave early, do look for the thrilling conclusion on Country Bookshelf's YouTube channel. If you have questions for Margaret or Mark, it's a bit of a tongue twister, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or you can leave them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end as time allows, but you can leave them at any time. If you run into any tech issues along the way, I recommend first exiting and re-entering the webinar. If that doesn't work, look for that stream on YouTube. And if you're having trouble with sound, do give headphones a try. I do want to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for all those who have joined us this evening. Offensive or inappropriate comments will see the user dismissed. So without further ado, Margret Grebowicz explores the cultural aspects of environmental problems and solutions in her writing and public speaking. She is the author of Whale Song, The National Park to Come, Why Internet Porn Matters, and co-author of Beyond the Cyborg Adventures with Donna Haraway. She is currently associate professor at the University of Silesia in Katowice, Poland. This year, she's also a visiting scholar at the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State in Tucson. Margret regularly publishes in public-facing venues like The Atlantic, the Philosophical Salon, and Slate, and she is the founding editor of a new book series called Practices, to be published by Duke University Press. Mark Yakich is the Gregory F. Curtin, S.J. Distinguished Professor of English at Loyola University, New Orleans, where he is the director of the Center for Editing and Publishing. He's the author of Unrelated Individuals Forming a Group, Waiting to Cross, which was a national poetry series title from Penguin, and The Making of Collateral Beauty, The Importance of Peeling Potatoes in Ukraine, and more. So you can check those out on our website as well. With Christopher Schauberg, he is also the co-founder and co-editor of airplanereading.org, a new media project that aims to rejuvenate airplane reading. In spring 2012, Mark was a Fulbright Fellow in the Faculty of Letters at the University of Lisbon. So, with all of those praises sung, Margret, Mark, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thanks. I want to make a quick correction there. The Beyond the Cyborg is not co-authored with Donna Haraway. It's a book about Donna Haraway, who's an environmental philosopher and theorist and a sort of jack of many trades, a very famous public intellectual. So it's a book about her work. And the other slight correction there is that it's Arizona State University is actually in Phoenix, not in Tucson, although I'm quite fascinated by Tucson as well. And I did just spend a good few months traveling around Arizona, exploring the border and just so many of the different wilderness spaces in Arizona. And that is thanks to the Center for Philosophical Technologies. And I do want to say a few thank yous before we start, if that's okay with everyone. I'd like to thank Country Bookshelf, and I'd like to thank Mark Yakich, of course, for doing this launch with me, for agreeing to do this launch with me while he is on vacation, on a spectacular vacation, as we can all see. And I'd also like to thank everyone who has supported this book. It's been a good few years in the making. And I'd like to thank my endorsers, Steve Shaviro, Kim Stanley Robinson, Bill McKibben, and Martin McInnes. And I would like to thank everyone who invited me along the way to come and present this work at various universities, to explore these ideas and to talk about them with me. You're all acknowledged in the acknowledgements, I hope. So I just wanted to say thanks.
Thank you, Margaret.
Mark?
Thank you. That's great. I first want to say I've only met Margaret once before on the Zoom, so but we had this connection right away through our friend Chris Shaberg, who edits the Object Lessons series, which Margaret wrote a book called Whale Song, and I just finished a manuscript called Soccer, called Football, but about soccer. That's coming out next year with Object Lessons. So he's the one that connected us, but I was happy to. There it is. To read this, I'd read Whale Song, a very tight book about whales and silence and music and Voyager, Carl Sagan, and the depths of the oceans. And then this one, Mountains and Desire, we're going the opposite direction. That was my first thought when I started reading it. But I think Margie does a really tremendous job in 96 pages or so, somehow being, super smart, but never condescending to the reader. This book's really an exploration that makes you more curious than anything else. It brings up questions and some answers, but mostly brings up questions for you to really think about. And I didn't know a lot about mountaineering, alpinism, climbing, whatever you want to call it, before I started looking at this at all. But I quickly became fascinated. So one of my first questions, Mountains and Desire, right there in the first chapter, and I guess I should have known this, right? Because of the movie Free Solo, which I haven't seen anyway, okay? Like I said, I'm not like a big fan, but Margie, you talk about this right there in the first chapter about the fan culture. And in fact, you write, quote, fan culture itself holds answers to important life questions. And for me, this kind of writing a book about soccer the last year, I have pretty much a love-hate, but more on the side of hate about fans and soccer matches, mainly because oftentimes their behavior is just deplorable when they're watching the game and at the stadiums. And luckily, one good thing out of COVID was that fanless stadiums were there for soccer games. But you maybe rethink this, talk about fan culture. So I wonder if you could talk about fan culture of climbing a little bit, because you, like I said, fan culture, you say, itself holds answers to important life questions. Could you explain this or give an example of this with respect to climbing?
Well, I think we might be talking about two slightly different things. And I don't exactly remember how I put it, but I would like to imagine that I said that fandom itself, I don't know if I said fan culture, but that fandom, it's the state, right, of being a fan, holds answers to important questions that we haven't really started to take note of. And the reason this was important to me is because when I was working on these, well, what really started as a series of essays that later became a book, when I was working on these pieces, the first question I got from everyone was, do you climb? And if my answer was no, which it is, my answer is no, I do not, right? I hike, but that's not exactly the same thing. I could tell that the attitude, right, of my interlocutor changed right away. And so there was this idea that there were no insights to be gained from someone who didn't climb about climbing. And I thought, well, that doesn't quite seem right, right? It especially doesn't seem right when, as I make a big deal of in the book, mountaineering has had a sort of adoring silent public watching from the bleachers for a good 100 years. When that reporter asked George Mallory, the New York Times reporter asked George Mallory, why do you do this? And he said, because it's there, right? And this, because it's there, once you start looking for because it's there, just in culture and history from that point forward, it's everywhere. People have requoted and requoted and requoted and paraphrased this in various ways in just about every single context you can imagine, like contexts that have nothing to do with mountaineering. So it was clear to me that there is a public here to talk about, even though this public has been sort of invisible and silent in a way that, of course, the football public is the opposite, right? I mean, soccer fans are famously the most obnoxious. Like everyone loves to hate soccer fans. I mean, even soccer fans love to hate soccer fans. So I think that we're talking about sort of two very different phenomena. I don't know that climbing has a fan culture, but it absolutely has fans. And we know this. I started sort of noticing this when over the last few years, these events happened that had this massive reception in the media. One of those events was the death of Uli Steck. Another one of those events was the sort of, the trashification of Everest, which every single, major newspaper talked about at length. And then I think this moment sort of culminates in Free Solo, and then Free Solo winning the Oscar for Best Documentary. And the amount of attention and conversation around these events, first Uli's death, and then what's happening to Everest, we don't know, what should happen to Everest, oh my gosh, and then Free Solo. If you put those things together and see how much attention was paid, it gives you an idea of how many people are invested in these questions. And these are people who will never, ever climb a mountain. Right. These are people who might never, I don't know, leave their living room, and yet they're very invested in these questions. And so that's really what the book is about. Yeah.
The Uli's death and then Free Solo, I think that's the argument you make in the book, is this is a crucial time, and that's why you wrote it. I mean, the why there question, I mean, why go to the moon, right? Why go to Mars? It's still very much growing out of the mountaineering, right? And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes, why, because it's there, becomes the sort of like, this conversation, this mini conversation, this microcosm, right? For asking oneself why one wants to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's part of the point in the book that I find fascinating, though, because you plumb that from the other side or from a different direction, meaning if we've climbed Everest, right, during all seasons, and K2 and El Capitan now has been, mounted, or whatever word you want to use, well, is there any more why there with respect to climbing? That's the other half of this, right?
Yeah. And that, I've been very careful. I mean, I think it's very much the question we need to ask ourselves, but I'm certainly not, going to answer it. I'm certainly not going to answer it for climbers. That would be absurd. And I think you're going to get very different answers depending on who you talk to. Mm-hmm. But there's certainly a kind of anxiety around it, around the question of why do this anymore? What's at stake here today? There is an anxiety. There's a kind of, tremoring around this, and you can tell that. My book is actually what the book is a series of examples of this, right? Yeah. Of all the ways in which we can see that something is crumbling here. Something that's been that's been held in this kind of state of tension since Everest was declared possible.
Right.
In those 1920s, 1920, 21, 22, 24 expeditions that said, okay, we can actually climb this. And from that moment, the Mallory expeditions, from that moment, there's always the shadow of the possibility that humans are doing it for the wrong reasons. And you can see it in all of the mountaineering literature that comes out in the 50s, when the first ascent of Everest happens, and suddenly everyone wants to read and write. Like there are like armchair mountaineers at that point. You know, mountaineering books, how to mountaineer becomes a coffee table book in the 50s.
Right.
Right. So, and there's always the chapter in there about the person who's doing it for the wrong reason, who wants it too much, who doesn't have the right relationship to the mountain and to the environment, and who isn't sort of there's a purism at work in mountaineering, pop mountaineering books, certainly. And that tension just gets ever greater, I think, with time. And we are really witnessing a moment when that tension is really vibrating.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that you say in the book, and this goes back to the fan thing, I still keep going back, but it's audience, and how that was, even from the beginning of Mallory, or someone said that was part of the strength, is we knew there was an audience or someone, right? But now with social media, you say, social media, free solo, the narrative, right? You talk about the narrative structure of the documentary and the climb, but the audience now is, I don't know, can you talk about that? It's very interesting in the book what you say about that. This is another part of the point of writing now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that Uli's death was such a shock was because we were so, I mean, I think most of us, especially the climbers, are very familiar with climbers dying, right? But non-climbers are much less familiar with climbers dying. And Uli's death sort of hit, I think, in this place where everyone was like, but how could it be that the greatest speed climber in the history of the sport just fell? And then, of course, the moment a couple seconds later is like, well, of course he just fell. Look what he's doing. Of course so there's this sort of insanity, right, around this moment where everyone's like, no, this couldn't have happened. And then the same people are like, of course it happened. It will always happen because it's the inevitable tragedy that comes with mountaineering. What's wrong with you that you don't know that? Right. So it's, Uli's death brought out a kind of almost like a neurotic relationship of the public, and a kind of neurotic kind of expectation that the public had, that a certain level of expertise really meant that you were safe, right? And that even though we know it's dangerous, and yet people aren't really dying as much as they used to, or they're not dying in the same ways that they used to. So it's like dangerous, but it's not as dangerous, and the risks kind of don't mean the same things as they used to. I mean, we're facing all of this just in late capitalist life, right? In our daily lives, we're facing our constant. We're constantly confronting what risks are worth it, what actually constitutes risk anymore. Yeah. Right, those kinds of things. So I think what's interesting about the reaction to Uli's death is how much we really weren't prepared for it, and the media response really shows that we weren't prepared for it, and people's response shows that we weren't prepared for it. It was not the same thing as some other celebrity death. Mm-hmm. Right? It was not the same thing as Kobe Bryant's death. It wasn't. It was a different kind of event, right? Because of the nature of the sport.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this comes up too. I mean, death in the book so many times. I mean, and maybe that's mountains and desire and death. Sometimes I was thinking that in the book. I mean, death kind of, the idea of risk, but death pops in and out of the book. On page 50, I remember taking this note, and this is what you write, Margaret, quote, death takes on a different meaning when the context is no longer one of discovery. And then my question is this the reason for the subtitle in your book, some of it, Climbing versus End of the World, or is End of the World more the environmental part of it? Like, because when I think about, and Margaret and I were talking before we got on live, but about how some of her books are taking on these huge topics or huge ideas, but she also wants to make them very personal for the reader somehow, in terms of feeling, whether it's emotion or something. So when I think of Climbing versus the End of the World, which is the subtitle of the book, I think of, well, the end of the world, we could talk about the end of, the earth and all that, but also everyone's going to have the end of their world, right?
Yeah, and what's even worse is that we're having it even before we die.
What do you mean by that?
So it's not just the end of my world when I die, right? In the future, we are in a constant state of these very strong feelings of precarity and stress and worrying about our loved ones dying. There's a kind of proximity to death that I think is really dramatic these days. Whether we're imagining it or not is really beside the point, right? But we're definitely imagining. We are definitely experiencing it. There's a proximity to it, and there's a kind of hopelessness around it. And I think, and this is just my position, maybe it's not everyone's, but I think that hopelessness is tied to a kind of, world that's been used up, right? To a world that's been where we can't justify death and loss in terms of the gains that come with going out into the unknown, right? The gains that come with learning something new anymore. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. And this makes it sound like your book is really dark, but I don't find it, there's that's balanced out by other moments. So what just occurred to me was another part in the book where, let's see if I can find this bit on my notes. It's about almost a continuum. And when I read it in my mind of walking and hiking and then climbing and slowness. And this idea, and you bring this up really well in one of the chapters about how, on the one hand, to me, when I read this, the book, it talks about Everest being Mount Trashmore, right? The commodification, the commercialization, all those kind of negative things, right? Like capitalism. At the same time, there's this great thing about climbing where, and you say this, and I had no idea about this, but when you're getting to the top of Everest or whatever, you can only take a couple steps at a time and sit down you have to sit down for 5 minutes after 1 or 2 steps.
Right.
And this slowness is, the opposite of our rampant, super treadmill life, even during COVID. Now we're ramping up again, but could you talk about that slowness? And is that part of the neurotic part of it?
I think today it's been, yeah. I think today there's something neurotic about it because, again, okay, so in my book, I really want to let me start over. In my book, I really want to make the point that none of these things are I'm not making any universal claims here about mountaineering or about desire or about the human condition or anything like that. And that's really important because so much philosophy of mountaineering does that. It does this kind of thing where it's like, we have this kind of insight into what it means to be human and what it means to be in the world. And, mountaineers know this sort of universal human truth, right? That they can share with us. And we go to them for this. Why do you do it, George Mallory? Tell us, right? Enlighten us. And one thing I really want to insist on is that these insights that mountaineering brings, I think they're very real, but they're also very changeable, right? They are They change over time. What they mean and who they matter to changes over time. And so that slowness, I think, is one thing. I'm really obsessed with this. I'm really interested in what has happened to this. The slowness doesn't change. The fact that you have to slow down is just a sort of physiological fact, right? It's a kind of, there's a brute fact here. But what it means to the audiences at home, right? And then what it means in commercial mountaineering has changed quite a bit, right? So today, in a lot of high-end tour operators in the Himalaya, one of the things that they advertise is how quickly they can get you up and down the mountain, right? And by quickly, I mean, it still takes, weeks, like, over a month of just being there alone. I don't exactly want to give a number because I'm not sure how it differs from tour to tour, but and then there's massive, training and acclimatization training on the ground, sort of at home before you even go, and then you have to acclimatize it at base camp, and then you have to acclimatize along the way. So it still takes a long time, but that they are advertising that they can do it faster is interesting to me. Right? That was not a goal 100 years ago. That was not a goal of being in the Himalaya. It wasn't about doing it. If it was about doing it faster, that was only because, like, food was running out, or you had a weather window that you had to fit yourself into, or because you had only this much oxygen and you were going to run out at some point, and there were sort of very brute constraints. Now the brute constraint is I've got to get back to work, right? I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I got to get my Everest summit in, but I got meetings back home, guys. So it's the constraints are very different. And so, yeah, what time, I mean, we know there are people, who have been writing about this for a long time, in very articulate ways. Time means something different now. There are these alternate temporalities happening at the same time in the world at all because of our condition right now. But then what does that mean in a mountaineering context, when mountaineering has always been about managing time, slowing, doing the slowness just fast enough to survive, but also doing it so slowly that you survive, right? It's this kind of dance with time. And what I found when I was reading books about it is that everyone looks to that moment, the very one that you pointed out, where you're just down, where you're just, taken down to your knees, where you are at your physical, where your body says, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do now.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone looks to that moment for answers. Everyone, I think climbers very much do, but non-climbers are definitely fascinated by that moment, right? We want to get at that moment. We want the answers that moment can yield. And my point is, those answers are actually changing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had a very mini moment like this. I mean, mini, but last week we were in Bandelier, the cliff dwellings, with our whole family. And you could go into the cliff dwellings and look up in the, the ancient people's caves, right? But there's something called the alcove. You go there a half mile, and you have to take like 140 steps or 140 feet up on these ladders to get to this really tall cliff dwelling. So my family, my wife, and our 3 kids did this. So I kind of thought, well, we have a 5-year-old. Is he going to be able to do these ladders? Like, some of them are like 35 steps at, like, a pretty steep thing. So, and it was very narrow. And they have these things before we go, like, if you have fear of heights, don't do this, blah, blah, blah. So we get all the way to the top, all of us, a little sweaty palmed. And then the 5-year-old decides he doesn't want to go back down the ladders. So there really wasn't a choice. So I had to carry him with one hand and then get myself down the ladder. And this was, I've never climbed, but this was very physically, he weighs 48 pounds. I only weigh 153 myself. I mean, and so I had to go one rung at a time, holding with my left arm, the ladder, you know, going down these stairs, and then him on the other. And my wife's kind of having a panic attack, you know. She's just sees him falling. That she told me that. And people are like taking photos from down there. But in that moment, what you just talked about, like, I didn't realize till I was doing it, like, you just go into this, or I went into this, I was totally calm. Maybe it was like a, you know, hashtag, you know, life goals, or I don't know, hashtag one of these things that you mentioned in the book. But it was a moment where, you know, you just know you have to do it. And that chapter you talk about, you know, what's humanly possible or not. These people, you know, climbers who are ultra, you know, Alex Honnold from Free Soul. I mean, is that human? Should we aspire to be like that? How do you categorize that? But I had this very small moment of, you know, I just had to get down this ladder, this series of ladders with this 5-year-old, and I couldn't screw it up. And I just went into this other place where I've been a few times during panic situations. And it was curious. Afterwards, you know, you couldn't be so self-aware, let's put it that way. My usual self-awareness of being a poet, I had to be not self-aware in that moment what I was doing. I just had to do it, if that makes any sense. In the zone, whatever you want to call it. And you know, I mean, I know this from other pursuits, but there was a moment there that is hard to describe.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the reasons that people are so interested in mountaineering, is because there are so many of those moments, and we want them. I mean, I'm not saying you wanted that at that moment. That's not the point, right? But as you're telling the story, you know, there's something kind of exhilarating about hearing how that transported you, right? And the reason it's so exhilarating is because our daily lives lack moments of transport so much, right? Is because we're, you know, arguably living in an emotionally very deadened and difficult, you know, time. So I don't even really know how to describe it without sounding ridiculous, because it seems so obvious to me that we're really in trouble culturally. And so we look to these moments when, you know, when someone says, and then this thing happened to me, because that's all we've got, right? Because that's all we've got. Like, if it's not happening to me, let me at least watch a movie about somebody it's happening to. Right. That's why I'm so interested. That's why I write about big wild animals, because, you know, I don't have a lot of encounters with big wild animals, but I know that when people talk about encountering wild megafauna, they say there's nothing like it. This will change your life. There's nothing like it, right? And I write about mountaineering and climbing and rock climbing, because rock climbers say there's nothing else like this. I get something from this that I can't get from anywhere else, right? Yeah. It's also why I write about sex. I used to write about, you know, sex, desire in this very literal way, and sex and sex culture and what we want from it, right? It's why my first book was about pornography. What is it we're actually after, right? Mm-hmm. But we're after, you know, and the argument is that we're actually, ironically, after something real, right? At a time when it's in short supply, and we know it's in short supply, and we can feel that it's in short supply.
Yeah, I mean, you know what helps me, and it's because I've been a poet for a long time, and people think poets are, you know, they have all kinds of assumptions about poets, kind of like maybe they do about climbers and things, but you know, they think it's all about getting in touch with their feelings and being sensitive and all that. And that's really, to me, some poets are like that. To me, it's not like that. To me, it's trying to re-see things that are so familiar. And so, you know, defamiliarization, that idea, but also just tell the truth, but tell it slant. Emily Dickinson, just trying to see something just a little bit, because things are so, you know, over the years, the older you get, the more inured you get to things. So the more, I guess what helps me in those moments you're talking about is play And I mean like kind of that childlike play, which is why I like to paint and play with words. I'm not trying to express myself. I'm not trying to express damn thing. I'm trying to play with words because I want to re-see the world. So anyway, this is kind of what I try and get across all the time to my students, for example, is, you know, poems, the best poems are trying to make you re-see something that you think you know.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's a thing, like what a net is, a collection of holes held together with string, or an emotion, perhaps. But I think you're coming from a different avenue, but we're talking about the same thing in a lot of ways. There's nothing like climbing, right? Because it's helping you re-see some things, maybe.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I would only add that it's, you know, you were very generous to say that this happens because as we get older, we get I don't remember what you said. We get something like we get
Inured to things, or
we get inured to things. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a lot more serious than that. You know, I mean, I think the crisis is more serious than that. I mean, just what's happening in our jobs, what's happening with labor in general, what's happening with relationships in general, culture, nation, you know, again, precarity, feelings of precarity, systems breaking down everywhere we look, and none of us armed with the skills to deal with it. These are new phenomena, right? These are new phenomena that I think are having massive, you know, emotional effects. Emotional isn't even the right word, you know, psychological, I don't know, you know, effects on just attunement, the way we are in the world, our lives, live the way we live, right? So we're looking for life. This is how I would put it. We're looking where we want, what we're after is life, right? While late capitalism or the Anthropocene or whatever you want to call this massive mess that we've created, while it literally sucks the life out of us, right? While it literally exploits us on the level of our living bodies and our desires, on the level of our most vital functions, right? It exploits that. And so what we're after, what we're hungry for is actually life.
So the experience of life, not just the patterns that we're so used to.
Right. Right. Feeling alive.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to come back to soccer again because it's been on my mind for the last couple of years and I've been playing for like 40 years. But this was one of the things I talk about, which is parallel to climbing, I suppose, is that this in the zone feeling that people talk about. And when I play soccer, everything else goes away. This idea of everything else going away, right? Time kind of becomes not there and there. I'm thinking, but I'm just very much, I'm in patterns, but they're so physically and mentally. This is part of the thing about climbing I think is different than writing poems or reading a poem, which is true of sex too, though. You're physically in it and you're psychically in it and psychologically in it. Climbing, if you're playing a sport, maybe cycling, whatever it is, but you are very much alive because you have to be. It necessitates it. And that physicality is, an office job, doing a lot of the stuff like we're doing now, Zooming, there's hardly any physicality going on there.
Right, exactly.
You say this in the book a couple of times about the sheer just physiology of the body and how important this is to climbing, even if the summit, you don't make it to the summit, even if you're not a climber, but you're a hiker. Yeah.
And again, there are sort of multiple levels of this. Climbers climb, when we talk about climbing culture, if what we mean is how climbers understand what they are doing. That's a very different thing than what I'm calling sort of contemporary climbing culture, which is me reading the New York Times, right, about some climbers,
Yeah.
who like fell or summited or something. That's a very different thing. I'm interested in that, in the tension between them, but I'm really interested in that second phenomenon too, because again, what the limits of the human body means is different in the one context and in the other. How that phrase functions, how that imaginary, like, oh, the limits of the human body. Wow, right? Yeah, I mean, that's serious stuff. Like, we want to know about that. We want to learn from that. We want to maybe have that, right? It means very different things, I think, in those two different climbing cultures.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating in the book. I mean, we won't touch that now, but even the oxygen, no oxygen debate is very much about that too. And I found that fascinating because I had no idea there was a debate about oxygen.
Massive debate about oxygen, and it's not going anywhere. And that's also interesting, is that it's just not, like, you'd think this is something that would just kind of, I don't know, be replaced by some other debate or something, but it's just not going anywhere. It's this one thing that we keep sort of bandying about, that it's got to be without oxygen in order for it to be, you know, really elite climbing and
Right.
and all that stuff. And yeah, I find it, well, again, you know, I'm an armchair climber, so I'm just watching, like everyone else. I'm just watching with fascination. Hi, Jessica.
Hi. I'm gonna throw a question out while I wait to see if any of our audience has a question that they would like to pose. But it struck me listening to you, and bringing in that oxygen debate, and you got to have the right connection to the mountain and all of that kind of thing. Like that is a very sort of purity kind of culture to have. And would you perceive that as gatekeeping, and who's supposed to be on what side of the gate?
Well, so my first answer is no. I mean, because when I was doing this research and I sort of learned what climbers, you know, just how very rigorous the training is. I mean, we are talking about elite athletes here. So they get to keep some gates. You know, they have earned, I mean, if they're not keeping the gates, who's going to keep the gates, right? So I wouldn't call it gatekeeping in a kind of negative way. It gets complicated when we are talking about paraclimbing, when we're talking about mobility impaired climbers or mobility challenged climbers. But paraclimbing now has its own, it's a massive world unto itself, with new gear being invented, with climbers, paraclimbers themselves being really active in the building of bionics, for example, because they're the ones who can say, here's what I need in order to do this thing. You know, they're the only ones who can tell the engineers, right? Or they become the engineers themselves and actually do both the climbing and the bionics. So that's sort of a world unto itself. What kind of gatekeeping happens there? I don't know. I'd be very interested in hearing about it from someone, you know, in that world. But yeah, when you're talking about, you know, I think when you're talking about sports and when you're talking about athletes, there's no way to get around a kind of purism. It's there, and it has wonderful effects sometimes, right? And it has less wonderful effects. And again, it might depend on whom you ask.
Mm-hmm. I would also be curious, and you touch on this a little bit in the book, and you already seeded my question, bringing up the paraclimbers, but also thinking about other marginalized communities in an outdoor space, and the idea that these climbers have the right attitude and relationship with the mountain when there are, in most cases, an indigenous people that already have a relationship with that place, like capital P signifier place, and the way that they are then allowed into or not that same space, particularly with a reflection on colonialism and capitalism, as you've said.
Yeah, I mean, I think again here we'd have to be clear about where we're talking about, right? I mean, it's these are hard things to generalize about. Um, and I only learned that kind of going in. I didn't know it at first. In the US, right, so much climbing takes place on public lands, and public lands have this history, right, of um, Native American displacement and dispossession. And, you know, in Europe, the situation is very different. And alpinism, high altitude climbing, really sort of began in Europe. So when and then it sort of moved over into Asia and has a very specific kind of colonizing shape to it. But when we're talking about sort of the birth of high altitude mountaineering, I very much understand why alpinism just became it just won its fight to be a UNESCO world, I forgot what it's called, UNESCO world cultural practice, something like that, right? One of these things where the practice itself is now considered a kind of endangered cultural artifact, right? And one of their arguments, as they were making this argument to UNESCO, is, look, we're the ones who know how to take care of these mountains. We've been doing it. You know, and again, as opposed to whom, right? As opposed to development, right? As opposed to industrialization. Yeah, like who do you want taking care of your mountains? So that, you know, I can also see very much that argument that there is a real kind, I don't know what the word is, a kind of honest and good, and I don't like any of these words, but that there's a kind of authentic, I roll, authentic thing going on in climbing and in the history of climbing that we can separate out. That, I mean, I don't think that it's a ridiculous claim to make, to say that climbers are able to have better or worse relationships with their environments.
Interesting. Well, I do have a question from our audience. Ron asks, in the discussion talking about climbing, the discussion reached for analogies like soccer, like sex, and it included stories, climbing down a ladder, carrying a child. How are analogies and stories and language circling a thing? Is the thing climbing an experience while climbing, something ineffable, or something else?
That's a good question, Margaret, huh? Wait, it makes me think of a kind of part in the book that I didn't get to mention to you. It's this part about Nan Shepherd that you mentioned.
Yeah.
We discussed, it's chapter 1 even there, page 10. You say that she's onto something when she talks about how the mountain is shaped by humans and not just physically, as in leaving trash or making trails, right? And then, you know, quote, what more there is lies within the mountain. Something moves between me and it. And then my question, what's she getting at? Is that what you and I were getting at? The there-ness of the mountain, or that, I don't know. But Nan Shepherd, I like that part. It was interesting because this idea that I didn't quite understand it, but I was somehow intuitively drawn to it. What more there lies within the mountain? Something moves between me and it, right? I mean, what's that about? It sounds very mystical even.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that Shepherd quote as well. And, you know, she never tells us. She never tells us what it is. And I think, I mean, Ron's question is almost like what we were talking about before we went live. When I was talking about, you know, Mark had asked me, what is it I'm after as a writer? And the first thing I came up with was, I want to set a mood. And then he's like, what does that mean? And I was like, I don't know. But if I really think about what I mean by that, it's something like this. what I think I'm circling around, as Ron puts it, which is correct. What I think I'm circling around is how it is that we feel in the world, right? And how to locate our experiences and our modes, our emotions and our attunements as individuals with particular lives and histories that are unrepeatable, right? We're only going to happen one time, each one of us. Those, how we locate those souls, those people, right, in this larger generalized conversation that's happening about the end of the world, about and to answer Mark's question from earlier, by the end of the world, I mean all of this, right? I mean the end of when we're talking about, planetary destruction, but also how we are talking about the end of social life, depression, all of the conversations around a kind of social attrition happening. So I'm interested in that connection. That's what I'm circling around, and I just keep circling because what I understand myself to be doing as a writer is trying to get a reader there, right? Trying to get a reader to that place. So it's not that I can tell the reader what that is, right? What I'm trying to do is create an experience of the reader saying, aha, okay, well, this is, wow, okay, I have these feelings. I have these feelings in this world. How am I going to think about the relationship between my feelings and what's happening around me, right? What's happening in the environment. And I mean, and I should contextualize all this by saying I'm not trained as a writer. I think this is very important. I'm not trained as a writer at all. I mean, my training is in philosophy. I'm trained as a theorist, and I think there's so much happening around questions of environment that environmental theory is not getting at very well, right? And so what do we need to do? How do we need to write? How do we need to approach writing and communication and the production of culture, right? As people who are actively doing that, who make their livings doing that. How do we approach that to get people to a better a better place around environment?
Fantastic. Jonathan says, given how dependent climbing is on aluminum, Gore-Tex, rubber, nylon, steel, etc., isn't climbing itself, despite claims about nature and care, a sort of industrial encounter with mountains?
Well, Jonathan, you would have loved this chapter in Mountaineering from 1950. When was it? 54, I think it was written, which talks about, it's this fantastic chapter, and it's on mountain walking, and it's on the proper way to walk, and it gives you sort of technique for what mountain walking is and how it's different than your normal walking, and how it puts you in a completely different mode. I agree with all this, by the way. Puts you in a completely different mode, and it can generate all kinds of new experiences and new thoughts for you, right? And then it says, but beware the ironmonger. So, Jonathan, I agree with you. We got to beware the ironmonger. I don't know. I wondered a lot about this when Free Solo came out, because of course the big conceit of Free Solo, the fire that burns under Free Solo, is that here is just, man versus mountain with no gear whatsoever except his climbing shoes and his little bag of chalk that he wears, around his waist. That's it. No ironmonger here. And yet, I'm not sure who the ironmongers are anymore. And I'm not sure if the ironmongering lives in the iron, if you will, right? If it actually lives in the amount of gear or the dependence on the oxygen, or I mean, talk about industrialization, just the science before you even get to what mountaineers are carrying, the amount of science that goes into determining what they should carry and what those, I mean, as you're pointing out, Gore-Tex, the materials, right? Just the material science that's involved in figuring out how to, you know, make it so that your feet don't freeze and that they don't stay wet and all of these things. It's really extraordinary. But I have my doubts that the ironmonger lives in the gear and the science. I sometimes wonder if, you know, there might be some ironmongering going on in Free Solo in a kind of, you know, fantasy of, I mean, I have a kind of critique of Free Solo, which I love, by the way, and which I know by heart, and with all massive due respect to Alex Honnold and everyone involved. And but for me, there's a kind of interesting thing happening in that film where, and in the book, I actually compare that film to what Hugh Hare does as a professional climber, but also as a professor of bionics at MIT, right? And Hugh Hare is a paraclimber. He lost his feet in a climbing accident when he was, there's Hugh Hare, yes, in a climbing accident when he was a teenager. But he was for a long time considered one of the best climbers in the world. And I don't know how much climbing he does anymore, but it doesn't really matter. He's a star of the sport. He also happens to be a star of prosthetics engineering in the world at this moment, right? And specifically prosthetics engineering for elite athletes, although not only. And when you watch Professor Hare's TED Talks and you sort of hear him talk about it, you understand that it's very clear that he understands himself to be part of a society, right? To be answering questions like, how are we going to get more people to climb? How are we going to get more people to leave their houses and walk and just do stuff because it's good for them, for example, right? Those are the kinds of questions he's asking, which is very different than the kind of question that's posed by Free Solo, right? And so one of the things I say in the book is, you know, which one of these is actually, you know, more futuristic, right? It seems in a way that that Free Solo is more futuristic because it's just so pure and light. It's just all so light, and it's just ballet going up the mountain, and everything is so easy, and it's so kind of Instagrammable and amazing, and it's very consumable, right? But what we're seeing in biomechatronics is this kind of robotics, and it seems very futuristic because it's robotics, but it's also actually futuristic because it asks the question of what's going to happen to people, right? And that's a question that I think really responsible climbing has to ask itself. It can't just ask the question of what's going to happen to climbing, right? It's got a massive responsibility to its audience, right? And it should be asking the question, what's going to happen to us, right? So I'm actually kind of interested in all that science and in all that iron and in all of those machines, as long as the right that for me, it's that kind of context and framing that actually determines the ironmonger versus the good climber. These are not, you know, differences that I'm that interested in. But if we want to go there, the good climber for me is the one who's asking the questions about the future of social life, and equality. So, you know, social equality and making things possible for people, enabling, you know, all kinds of practices, rather than not asking those questions. That was a very long answer to your question, Jonathan. Thank you.
Do you feel up to one more?
Sure. Do you?
Sure. A few things this discussion has provoked from Emil. The idea that the world is getting smaller and our experience of things becoming banal. Second, the problem of experience, maybe what you call life, which has been progressively moved to the general since Francis Bacon. Individual experience lost authenticity in the empirical sense if it can't be generalized. And in a sense, because of the subject-object divide, we've perhaps lost our capacity to possess our experience. In light of these provocations, how is climbing a symptom of modernity, and how can it be thought through commodification, which is another way of being unable to possess our experiences? And then he apologized for that not being a very focused question.
As well he should. Jessica, next time you ask me if I'm up for one more, make sure that it's not Emil asking that last question, okay?
Got it.
It's a couple chapters of the book kind of really hit this, though.
Please tell me how.
What that last bit about, what was the last bit of the question, Jessica?
Let's see. Okay. How is climbing a symptom of modernity, and how can it be thought through commodification, which is another way of being unable to possess our experiences?
Yeah, no, this is definitely a couple chapters of the book, especially toward the end where they talk about gestures, which we didn't even bring up, but that's for the reader to get to, because that's actually the epigraph in the book. The front of the book is about gestures too, and I think Emil needs to get the book. Seriously, there's a couple chapters that are going to do justice to this. But Margaret, go ahead. I just wanted to register that because it's a very complex question, but I think it's there.
Well, I mean, I actually think that is actually the book. Except that I'm trying not to use any of that language. Right. So if I understand the question correctly, which I barely do, but let's say I do. I think that's what the book is precisely about, except that I'm not really starting with. I have trouble with the history of climbing. You know, every history of climbing talks about its relationship to the history of modernity. And I don't even know if we know what we mean by that anymore. And so I'm sort of, and the reason I say that is because we just say it so much. It's so like, oh yes, climbing and modernity, and of course the history of climbing, and of course the history of modernity. And this is one reason I really wanted to isolate a different kind of history, one that begins with it begins with Everest in the 20s. It begins with Mallory. And I want to say that has its own trajectory. And I actually would be interested in kind of mini histories, micro histories, if you will, of climbing. I don't think we have enough micro histories of climbing. So just like I don't like philosophy of mountaineering, I'm also kind of, I also have my questions about, you know, the history of mountaineering as a kind of, you know, grand narrative kind of space, because I'm not entirely convinced by it. I think there are all these micro histories that if we brought them out more would maybe give us different insights, right, on this. But what you say at the end, I mean, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. That because commodification makes us, how did you put it? That we don't know what we're experiencing anymore, something like that. Like we don't actually
unable to possess our experiences.
Yeah, right. So the book is very much about the co-optation of experience, of life, right? And so why we are chasing after it sort of ever more passionately, right? We're chasing after it as spectators because we're not getting enough of it, you know, in our own lives. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that all of this, I think mountaineering is highly vulnerable, right, to the kinds of shifts you're talking about. It's acutely vulnerable to them, which is why it's so weird that we continue to sort of popularly insist that it's this universal human practice that has not changed over time, right? That there's always been, you know, the human going up the mountain and being like, oh, here I am on the mountain, and that it always means the same thing. Like, that's just clearly not the case. So yeah, no, Emil's question is what the book is really about, except in a language that I really wanted to stay true to as an armchair mountaineer, as a fangirl, right? As someone who's just opening her laptop and reading newspapers and being like, oh, what happened in climbing? Or not even that, just like, what happened in the world, and why are we constantly reading about climbing these days, right? What's going on? So,
well, thank you for that, and thank you for that wonderful blurb and commercial for Mountains and Desire, Emil.
it feels good for that, yeah. And you should invite him back.
I did put the link to purchase the book back into the chat, so if you haven't grabbed your copy yet, do pick it up there. And I'm gonna hope this is a softball. Are you totally done with this idea of flow and mindset and alive life, or are you working on something completely different? And selfishly, are you considering other adventure sports to see if some of your conclusions or thoughts hold across adventures?
So at the moment, no other adventure sports, because what I'm doing is I'm writing a book about dogs, which, believe it or not, yeah, this question of life and desire and vitality, it's moving over into this new area that I'm sort of obsessed with personally, right? As a dog owner and as a dog enthusiast, I am now studying. Well, I don't know. Maybe this is a sport. Dog training. Dog owner culture. It's not a sport. I mean, it's not a sport in the sense of like elite, I'm not talking about that kind of training. I'm not talking about agility and like elite dog competitive stuff. But I mean, look, I'm interested in practices, right? I'm interested in the things we do, and sometimes the things we do repetitively. And what we get from them and what we want from them, right? So I think dog ownership involves some really fascinating practices, and it's another one of these spheres, just like climbing. It's one of these spheres where we keep being told that it holds the key to some universal human truths. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what I'm interested in is exactly not that. What I'm interested in is how these shifts in dog training culture actually reflect real shifts in being human, right? How the human actually changes, or not even the human, how we change, everything's changing, right? Everything's actually changing. So that's what I want to, I'm going to look to it as a kind of doorway into the same kinds of questions, right? But it's going to be dog training versus the end of the world. And by dog training, I don't mean with professional trainers, because I don't know if you're aware, but what's at the heart of dog training culture is this conceit, right? This idea that you have to do it. You can do it. It's not that hard. And furthermore, you're the one, as your dog's owner, who actually has to do it. So it's not, that I have it's not the sort of Cesar Millan thing where there's a dog whisperer and you can't do it. Only I can do it. I'm special, right? I'm a star in this regard. It's not about the stars. The shift has very much been to enabling individual dog owners and kind of equipping them with like agency and a ton of gear, right, Jonathan? It's super gear heavy. Talk about the ironmongers, and there's all kinds of debates around that, about do we need all this gear? Maybe we don't need the gear. Yes, we do. No, we don't. And So for me, actually, yeah, dog owner culture, which is what the next book is about. It'll be called Rescue Me. Dog owner culture is a microcosm for exactly the kinds of things that I was looking at in Mountains and Desire.
Wonderful. I'm very excited. Again, I just dropped the link in because some of you may have missed it, but purchase your copy of Mountains and Desire to get all of those answers that we didn't quite get to today. And be sure to follow us on Eventbrite for more. Hopefully we can see Margret again once Rescue Me arrives in the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you both
everybody.
for joining us this
Everyone for
evening.
coming.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Margret.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks, guys, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much. Many hearts. Lots of love. Nuanced.
Yeah, figure out.